So just a recap, and I'll say to the group as well. What we have is sort of a tentative schedule is, Khansa opens it up. I'll give very brief remarks. Janan will give very quick overview on elections at Electoral College, leaving something obviously for the group. Then Khansa will introduce all of you, and then you will have a conversation. So Khansa will kick it off with some questions, and she'll thank you and open the floor for questions. We have obviously some questions on standby in case we don't get any right away. And then, so that'll be around, I guess, 6:05 is when we're anticipating concluding the first portion. So Q&A will wrap up around 6:28. Khansa will thank everyone and then we'll conclude.
Oh, Karima, do you want to change your name too? Because your name right now says Karima personal email.
Thank you. Good eye. No. Why is it? That's okay. Thank you so much.
And Anatol, I'm so glad you didn't have an internet problem this time. Glad you're here.
Touch wood, right? Wi-Fi can never be completely relied on.
If any of us do get knocked off, we can just use the same link to rejoin. Yes. Okay. Inshallah.
I get knocked off, I will assume that it's somebody sending me a message. So.
All right. Thank you for that catch. So, Asia, how's it looking?
Sorry, just preparing the live stream and then we can start immediately.
You guys are super busy right now. I'm seeing your names popping up on all sorts of university adverts, elections, this and that. So thank you for making yourself available for our session.
Well, I'm going to go and vote today. Today is the second day of that one can vote in Washington. But there was a police shooting, about 4 blocks from me, and we live in a pretty nice neighborhood. But in Washington, the very rich, the very poor, it's not that much of a divide. I'm not very rich or very poor, and so near the voting place, it's chaos, right in the nation's capital. So.
Be safe. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Crazy time.
It is something like I've never seen, and I've been around a while. So.
All the more important, all the more reason to vote, right?
All the more reason to vote. I don't know a single black person who's mailing anything in. Every black person I know is taking it right there to a box to go in and voting. I love my mailman. I know his name is Richmond. He's a great cat. But I told him, man, I got to put mine right in the box, right in front of the, I have a black mayor and all these things, but I'm taking mine. Everybody I know, I have a buddy, one of my oldest buddies in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is very, real populated. He went to vote on Sunday morning at the Brooklyn Museum, line a mile long, New York City, 10 o'clock in the morning, Sunday. So.
Ms. Karima, are we good to go?
Yes.
Asil's the boss.
So have our attendees joined us?
Yes, and I'm going to share your slides as well. So everything is set.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel. We are happy to have you. We are excited to hear from you, engage with our audience and engage with our panelists. My name is Khansa. I'm a student at Georgetown. And I have interned with the US Embassy, and I'm currently working for them to, organize these panels and do some other programming. And I'm very excited to get this opportunity and engage with our lovely panelists and hear from them, interact with them, hear from you guys, and just explore the impact of elections on minority rights together, and also get the ability to understand how these elections are important in 2020, right? Because right now it's a very unique landscape. Firstly, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which not a lot of us have seen before, but even other than that, there are new political realities that we need to come to terms with, and new dimensions that we're exploring as far as ideologies are concerned. So we're happy that the US Embassy gave us this opportunity. Before we move on, let's hear from Ms. Karima, who's the current cultural attaché at the US Embassy's Public Affairs section. Ms. Karima.
Thank you so much, Khansa. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Very excited to see the turnout, and everyone's welcome. I wanted to say a few quick words before I hand it to the real experts for today's session. First of all, I want to thank Khansa again for her active engagement. She's a true success story for us. We are so grateful to have had time with her as an intern at the embassy, and now to see her really blossom and flourish and take on independent projects while studying. So it's just fantastic to see our interns go on to achieve great things. Just want to congratulate you, Khansa, and thank you. About today's program, I'm just so very excited about the topic. As most people know, the US elections are taking place this coming Tuesday, November 3rd. So it's, of course, I think on many Americans' minds, but in this age of globalization, certainly I think unless you're living under a rock, you are probably following the news and aware of what's going on in the States. So it's definitely a hot topic, and so excited to have the chance to have some esteemed experts talk about today's topic. These are truly historical times, as Khansa said, so all the more reason, I think, to talk about what elections today mean. If you see my name there on the screen, you could probably guess part of it's Arabic. That's not a coincidence. I'm a proud Arab American, and in the course of today's discussion, you'll hear about different minorities being engaged in US elections, Arab Americans not being an exception. There's one particular campaign I can think of, Yalla Vote, that's quite prominent, quite popular in the US, and amongst African Americans and Asian Americans and other minority Americans. You'll hear today from our esteemed panelists, what they're doing to really get out the vote, as we say. So just want to spend a minute to talk about today's title and what it is we're even going to be talking about today. So the title, as you can all read from the screen, is Retracing the Impact, the Role of Elections in Shaping Minority Rights in the United States. So I think before we dive into what that title means, and again, I'll leave it to the panelists to discuss, I just want to go over some basic definitions so we're all on the same page. So an election, according to any standard dictionary, is a process in which people vote to choose a person or group of people to hold an official position. Again, an election is a process in which people vote to choose a person or group of people to hold an official position. So what does vote mean? Why is that so important? Again, per any common dictionary, you look it up, a vote is a way to express your choice or opinion, especially by officially writing a mark on a paper, by raising your hand or speaking in a meeting. So what I'm trying to get at with going over these basic definitions, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, is that a vote is essentially a voice, and every vote counts. Every voice matters. If you were to leave with anything today from what I've said, I'd like you to remember Gandhi's words, which is, be the change you want to see in the world. You don't have to be in the US to internalize this mantra. Qatar is home to several civic leaders who make a difference every day, starting with our interns and the fabulous panelists we have joining us today, whom Khansa will introduce in a little bit. But allow me to thank you, Drs. Jocelyn Mitchell, Maurice Jackson, and Anatol Lieven, for sharing your time and unique insights with us today. Today's schedule, following my brief remarks, you'll hear from Janan, another one of our fantastic interns, who's currently a student at Georgetown University's main campus. Following that, Khansa will introduce our esteemed panelists, in addition to engaging with them in a conversation about a number of questions and topics related to today's theme. Then we'll open up for Q&A, and the session will conclude around 6:30. So without further ado, just one, I guess, administrative note. This session is being live streamed and recorded. So for any of you, your friends who couldn't make it, please encourage them to view the program at their own leisure on US Embassy Doha's Facebook page, along with other great programs we have upcoming on Education in the US and with Qatari comedian Hamad Al-Amari. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you now to Janan for her brief remarks and kick it off from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your introduction and everyone who's joining us today. The Embassy chose the topic of the role of elections in shaping minority rights in the United States, given that the elections are only a few days away. Presidential elections have been held in the US since 1989, making the 2020 presidential elections the 59th election in the history of the United States. Ever since, American presidential elections have been held on the first Tuesday in November. Yet the 2020 presidential election is very historical. This is the first time in recent American history that American presidential election is being held during a global pandemic. As it did in 1789, the United States still uses the Electoral College system established by the US Constitution, which today gives all American citizens over the age of 18 the right to vote for electors who in turn vote for the president. To win the presidency, Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden must get more than 50% of the Electoral College vote. As the 2020 presidential elections draw near, changes in the minority composition could have an impact on electoral outcomes. Minority groups are defined as groups of people whose practices, race, religion, ethnicity, or other characteristics are lesser in numbers than the main groups of those classifications. However, racial and ethnic groups are by no means monolithic, and in fact, there is a rich diversity of views and experiences within minority groups. Rather than partisan alignment, an important element of minority groups is voter turnout. The role of elections in shaping minority rights is an important topic since the US Census Bureau reports that around 33% of the US population were members of one or more ethnic or racial minority group. And for the first time, more than half of the nation's population under the age of 16 identified as a racial or ethnic minority. Among this group are Latino or Hispanic and Black residents who comprise nearly 40% of the American population. And despite challenges of casting votes while social distancing, an increase of absentee voting and new voting patterns are to be expected. Yet, a US presidential election has never been delayed in the history of the United States. We look forward to learning more about the role of elections in shaping minority rights in the United States from the distinguished panelists who are joining us today.
Thank you, Janan, for that brilliant introduction. I think it is all good to be reminded of the realities that we are talking about today. And also thank you, Ms. Karima, for your wonderful introduction. And now towards the stars of this show, which is our panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist for today is not just a professor at Georgetown University, Qatar, but also knows the true impact of political activism on a grassroots level, because he has always been and also been a community organization as well as a writer. Professor Maurice Jackson. Our second panelist for today is Dr. Jocelyn Mitchell, Dr. Jocelyn Sage Mitchell is assistant professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar, and is also frequently invited at Al Jazeera to be an election analyst for them. We're very honored to have you here, Dr. Mitchell. Our third panelist for today is Dr. Anatol Lieven. Professor Lieven is a professor at Georgetown University and was also the chair for the War Studies and International Relations program at King's College. Not only that, he has worked as an advisor for various governments, has various publications, has worked with various organizations as a journalist and news channels. So we're happy to have all of our panelists here today. And we're excited to hear from them. We're excited to give them this space where they can, make sure that we hear about their opinions, but give everyone an opportunity to learn from one another. So without further ado, moving on to our questions for today. We all know that the US electoral system is different from perhaps every other electoral system in the world. And Janan sort of began explaining it to us, but it is a very complex system. So before we move on towards, with any other thing, we will ask our first panelist for today, which is Dr. Mitchell, to please explain to us what the American electoral process is like and why it is different from any other electoral process in this world. Dr. Mitchell.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Khansa, and the US Embassy for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm so excited to learn from my fellow panelists. And have a great conversation with our audience as well. So it's a great question, like what makes our system so unique, right? Our electoral system. We are the oldest modern democracy in the world, and that's a real source of pride for many Americans. But there's a bit of a curse associated with that as well, because when you're the first, you don't get to benefit from setting up your electoral institutions by seeing how others have done it, right? And learning from their lessons. And it's interesting how if you look at the other major advanced industrialized democracies, and political scientists have done so, for example, Robert Dahl, and you compare our electoral system and our constitutional system with other advanced democracies, we're very unique, and sometimes in ways that aren't quite as democratic. If we define democracy as one person, one vote, then other systems sometimes have a little bit of an edge on us, which is a kind of an interesting thought. And for example, our federal system, right? Our system where we share responsibilities between the national level and the state level. That's only shared by about 30% of these advanced democracies. 70% have a unitary system. The Senate, having a Senate and House, so a bicameral Congress, which is important because all of the House seats in the National Congress are up for re-election, and a third of our Senate seats. So that's very important to be watching this November 3rd, as well as the presidency. Having a bicameral Congress is only shared by 20% of the advanced democracies. And then only 14% actually have this first past the post electoral system that we have, where we don't ask for a majority to win most of our elections, right? There are some majority systems, for example, at the state level in Georgia. They'll have a runoff if they don't get a majority, but on the whole, state by state and on the national level, it's just plurality. Whoever gets the most votes, whether it's majority or not, end up winning. It's only 14% of advanced democracies around the world. And just a final fact for you, we're the only ones out of these 22 advanced industrialized democracies that have a presidential chief executive who is elected separately from the legislature. And so just something for us all to be thinking about, even as we celebrate another round of democracy in the US, is to think how our specific electoral system helps in some ways, but also hinders in other ways the free and equal right to vote, the ability of one person, one vote to count in our system. And, you know, are there ways that we could usefully reform our institutions in the future to get more to that perfection that we are always striving towards in America? So I'll just start with that.
Thank you. So I think that was a very important introduction for all of us here, because all of us are necessarily not well versed in how the US electoral system works, why it's different from other electoral systems, even though we think a lot about the US electoral system just because of the prominence of the country politically. But we've spoken about the first element of it, which is the electoral system. And now let's talk about the second element of it, which is the voter base. So my second question is for Dr. Maurice Jackson. And Professor Jackson, can you please tell us which groups form the minority vote, and why is the vote important for these groups specifically in 2020? Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Khansa, and it's good to see you, and keep up the good work that you do at Georgetown University today. And thank you, Ms. Karima from the embassy, and Janan. Thank you all for my experience there in Qatar, and I look to see you again soon. You know, this question can be handled narrowly and can be handled broadly. By minority, in general, we mean those people who are underrepresented. So in this case, in the U.S. Institutions. So in this case, we mean African Americans, which are about 40 million people identify as that. Latino, about 60 million, and then about 3 million of people of Native American heritage. And of course, the African American people generally when we say African American, in many cases, we mean people who may have been born in America, United States for generations. And now it includes, in many cases, a large number of Caribbean Americans who are Caribbean is in the Americas, and in large numbers of people of African descent. By people of Latin American descent. Of course, there's so many countries in Latin America, and they are the oldest Latinx majorities, which would of course be the Mexican American or the Chicano people, and then the people of Puerto Rican descent, and then of course people coming from many different countries. And as I think, as someone pointed out, the people of Latin descent come from countries with many differing views about what it means, about the democratic aspect, and it's to be heard just as many people who are of a minority populations who have Arab descent, and this could be Yemeni, it could be Iraqi, it could be Syrian, it could be Saudi, it could be any, and in general, they may or may not be a coherent idea about what democracy means. Many came from many countries, some willingly, some are persecuted, and of course, many African Americans, many of the African American people did not, in general, who came here from slavery, did not come voluntarily. They came on slave ships and the descendants. So we have that broad. And so this election, therefore, has tremendous impact for the people of minority descent, whatever their political viewpoints. Generally with the African-American people, because of the historic struggles that they have, because of the struggles to vote, the voting blocks, the struggle for democratic rights, the voting blocks have generally been a bit more coherent. Understand this, though. African Americans only, there was the U.S. Constitution, but then the Civil War, and the Civil War broke the nation, and slavery was defeated. And with that, it was necessary to ensure democracy. And so certain amendments were passed: the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, rapidly in 1865, 68, and so forth. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves only. 65, the 14th Amendment gave blacks due process, which means they had the right to a jury trial, supposedly had the right, and the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. But over the last couple hundred years, we've seen the struggle for that extension of those rights, but also the constant thrust to deny those rights. And that's why this election is so important, because we see, and the people from throughout the world will want to understand, why is it when people want to vote, why are all these roadblocks put up? We were told about the question of democracy and the greatest democracy, but there are certain things that limit that democracy. The one the most important is the idea of voting on a Tuesday. Why? Well, most people go to vote on Saturday or Sunday or on the weekends. And then there have been those blocks, other blocks they've been putting forth of blacks. You go to, you want to vote. At one time you had to pay a poll tax. At one time you had to read a clause of the Constitution in Russian or Chinese or Arabic, whatever you didn't know. And all of these blocks. And we thought that the civil rights movement was fought to eliminate all of those things. Now, many of those things are back in place in different levels. And that is why this election becomes so important, not just for African Americans, but people who generally are struggling for equality.
Thank you, Professor. So you spoke about the importance of these amendments. You spoke about how people got this opportunity to vote, how this even came about. And one document that sort of enshrines all of it is the Constitution. So our next question is for Dr. Anatol Lieven. Can you talk about the American Constitution and how it is connected or its significance for the electoral process? Dr. Lieven.
Well, to understand the peculiarities of the American electoral system that Jocelyn talked about, you have to understand that it was not intended to be democratic. The founders regarded the word democracy as an insult. They wanted to found a federal republican system. It's worth remembering that, of course, the Constitution absolutely excluded other races at the time, and women had no right to vote. But until the 1830s, a very large part of the white male population also didn't have the right to vote. And the founders were very frightened of the idea of majoritarian democracy, and especially a feared link between what they saw as the passions of the masses and potential dictatorship. And of course, when the French Revolution happened and Napoleon took over in France, they regarded all their warnings as having come true. So they put in place a system full of checks and balances. And this worked pretty well as long as the people were not fundamentally divided over central issues. It broke down, of course, over slavery before the Civil War. The Constitution could not resolve that. It was resolved by victory, by Union victory. And in recent years, we've seen increasing problems stemming from the nature of the Constitution itself. Now, there are a variety of problems. One is the Electoral College. Both in 2000 and in 2016, the winner of the popular vote, a Democrat, lost the presidential election because they didn't get a majority of the Electoral College. As far as I know, that cannot exist anywhere else in the among advanced democracies. The Senate is absolutely not intended to be a democratic institution. It consists of representatives of the states, and every state has 2 senators, which means that a state with about 500,000 people, like South Dakota, has 2 senators, and a state with 40 million people, California, has 2 senators. Then there is the fact that I think uniquely among the advanced democracies, America does not have a National Election Commission. The rules for elections, for voting, the distribution of seats, how the constituencies are drawn up for the House of Representatives, are set by the states themselves. And now, in the past, it has to be said, both parties engaged in massive rigging from this point of view, the Democrats as well as the Republicans. Mayor Daley, Democrat mayor of Chicago, was rather particularly notorious in this regard. But in recent years, it has become above all a Republican thing to manage the elections, with the result that several times now you've had a situation in which overall the Democrats have won a majority, even a large majority of the vote for the House of Representatives, but have come up with either a minority of the seats or a much smaller majority than they would have deserved. Then there is the Supreme Court, which is portrayed under the American Constitution as a judicial institution, but is in fact a second legislature, which can make laws on the basis of, well, I mean, very often what a majority say that the founders would have said if they were still alive 230 years later. And can also, as we've seen, of course, overrule laws passed by Congress. So all of these not just are barriers to majoritarian democracy, but they are intended to be barriers. Now, the other thing about this is that the Constitution is basically now unreformable by constitutional means, because you need such a large majority of the states and of the Senate that in a very divided political system, that majority is impossible. Well, we will have to see what happens next week, but in my view, and following on from something that Professor Jackson said, I think that efforts to reform the Constitution will be one of the central themes of American politics for the generation to come.
Thank you, Dr. Lieven. Before we move on, I'd like you to expand a little on something that you mentioned, because it took me a lot of time to understand that, and I'm sure a lot of other people might have the same question. How is it possible for someone to lose the popular vote and then still succeed in becoming, the president, or vice versa?
Well, under the American Constitution, ordinary voters do not actually vote for the president. They vote for an elector to the Electoral College. And the distribution of seats in the Electoral College does not match the population exactly. Now this institution was introduced with the idea that basically the Electoral College was going to be a temporary kind of Senate or House of Representatives, in which the people elected to the Electoral College would then sit down freely to decide among themselves who was going to be president. And that was really an attempt by the founders to try to place yet another barrier against some populist demagogue sweeping the popular vote and installing a dictatorship. Or, of course, a situation in which two candidates were absolutely, the country was absolutely split. And to hold the country together, the Electoral College needed to come up with a compromise candidate. Now, in those terms, having an Electoral College which didn't correspond exactly to the population didn't matter, because that wasn't its purpose. But since then, what has happened is that the members of the Electoral College have nailed themselves legally, they have sworn, to vote for one candidate and not under any circumstances to change that vote. In other words, you can't have a situation where the Electoral College gets together and says, my God, how on earth have we been landed with this particular candidate? He's a threat to democracy, he's a maniac, we're going to vote for somebody else. Or on the other hand, we can't have a situation in which two candidates are basically dividing the country between them and threatening God knows what, civil disorder. We're going to come up with some reasonable compromise candidate who's more or less acceptable to both sides. That is not now legally possible, although it's been suggested that perhaps one might go back to that. So you see, here is another example of how this constitution was not, now it's supposed to be democratic. Everyone believes that it's democratic. Everybody in principle wants it to be democratic, but it wasn't set up that way. The other thing is that to understand the politics of the Republican right and the Christian right in particular, you have to understand that they see themselves as a minority, an embattled minority. They also look at the demographic figures and see that whites are going to be no longer a majority, still a plurality in the fairly near future. And they have become absolutely tied to the defense of the Constitution as it stands, because the Constitution as it stands gives them such advantages and protections.
It's actually so interesting that you're talking about how the Constitution serves as protection. And then Professor Jackson earlier spoke about how the election institution has sort of really evolved and how it still needs to become more inclusive. And I think Professor Mitchell will really answer our next question and sort of tie these two together. So Dr. Mitchell, can you tell us, has the institution of election impacted advocacy efforts in any way, shape, or form at all?
Great, thank you. And yes, I agree. This is a fascinating discussion and I'm loving it. I'm glad I'm a part of this. So I would say, building on, Maurice's and Anatol's comments, right? The expansion of voting rights is one of the major arcs of our country's history. It's all about the question of whether voting is a privilege reserved for some or a right guaranteed to all. And this debate has run through our political system for hundreds of years, even before the creation of our Constitution. When you look back at even the constitutions of the American colonies before they were states. At the heart of the issue is that there is not a constitutional right to vote. And as has been mentioned, we have had some amendments, right? We have had the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the 26th Amendment, all of which have expanded the ability of different groups of people to vote, but it's not a guaranteed right to vote no matter what. Anatol was right that democracy was not on the founding fathers' minds necessarily, but it is now, right? The arc of American history has bent toward more equality, more participation, and more democracy over time. So at this moment in time, while we don't have these overtly racist barriers to voting, like literacy tests and poll taxes, as Maurice mentioned, we don't have those anymore, but we still have institutional barriers to vote that matter for who ends up being able to express their voices on election day. A lot was made of the polls being wrong in 2016, right? But what if the polls weren't wrong? What if it was the electoral system that was wrong? When you think about it, polls measure the intent, what people intend to do on election day, but the electoral system determines what people are actually able to do on that election day. And if we care about making sure that all voices are heard, we as a nation can begin and continue to think seriously about the various ways to reform the system, including making permanent the changes that we've seen right now in this election regarding the pandemic, the changes to mail-in and absentee ballots and early voting days, as well as some other ideas like instituting automatic voter registration. We automatically register people for the draft, right? We automatically register you to die for your country. We can also automatically register you to vote for your country, right? So in sum, I agree with Anatol that reform of our institutions is now very much on the agenda and in the minds of Americans. We've realized over the last 4 years plus that we cannot depend on norms to make sure that our democracy functions. Our institutions need to be strengthened and they need to make sense for today's democratic age.
Thank you so much. So I think we've sort of really crystallized this notion that we do need a reform in the electoral system. We do need a reform in the process because the process doesn't work as well as we thought it worked. But let's just talk to Professor Jackson and understand if there was a connection, if there is a connection between minority rights and the election to begin with. Like, has there ever been a connection between the right to vote and gaining more rights for the minorities? If there is such a connection, how do you see it evolving today?
Yeah. Well, I could disagree a little bit. You tell any black person they don't have the Constitution the right to vote, and then you're ready to fight someone. We certainly do have the Constitution the right to vote. Slavery was fought over that. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The 21st Amendment gave blacks in Washington, D.C. So we can fill it with words and everything. Look, the Constitution was an imperfect document. Every living Constitution, including the French Universal Rights of Man, was flawed. But what African Americans looked at was how to take this. Let me give an example. The Bill of Rights guarantees a certain rights. Every American, every person who considers as a citizen, believes they have those rights, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to worship. And these were things that African Americans weren't given, but they took this and assumed that they were theirs, their own. You remember that the Civil War fought. Frederick Douglass, the greatest of Americans, disagreed with certain whites, including William Lloyd Garrison, who was an abolitionist, who didn't believe in constitutionalism. John Brown, who said the Constitution was written in blood and gave his life as the great fighter for black causes. So they were all these battles. But when Reconstruction came, and Reconstruction was the period after the Civil War, when African Americans for once had a chance to build institutions and schools and things like that were built, and blacks had the right, and they created a body where 20 or 30 black legislators from the South were elected. But then after Reconstruction ended, the Northern troops taken away, the Southern revanchists took back over, blacks, that right was taken away from them. They won a right, it was denied. And so therefore the modern struggle has been to restore those rights. And that's what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. That's why so many people went down south, to guarantee they had those rights and restore that. And so the battle for civil rights took that place. And then so you had civil rights amendments, you know, the Voting Rights Amendment, 65, the Housing Amendment, and many others. And that is what we're trying to preserve now. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, Attorney General Holder, who was the Attorney General of during the Obama administration, brought suit, Shelby County versus Holder. And in this, he was fighting for the extension of the Voting Rights Act. What had happened was that the Voting Rights Act said that they must be guarantees that there be no provisions put in any state that denied people the right to vote. And this came in the midst of what we call gerrymandering. What the gerrymandering really meant was that they tried to put all the blacks in one area so to weaken their representation. It still happens today. And so the extension of this comes up every 10 years. And so the extension of these means that there must be laws to protect these minority rights, because every year there are cases where they are taking them away. We saw a case in Georgia the other day where African Americans were represented in representing school board elections and things like that. And the people who ran the state changed the districts so they could dilute. And this happens all the time. These are violations of the Constitution. And so this is what comes up now, the extension of those rights. So in other examples, so you see, and it should be hard, because it's hard for me to understand. It should be hard for people anywhere in the world to understand why there are people who do not want minorities to vote. Why would you not want someone to express their rights? Why all this notion about mail fraud and everything, even though the Postal Service says it doesn't exist? Why all these elements to keep you from voting? A person who's disabled, who's in a wheelchair, or who has a pre-existing condition, wants to drop off their ballot in front of the a voting place or at the post office, they're denied that right. And every day we look where states, and it happened in Wisconsin and other states like that, want to keep. That's why in the world would you want to keep voting down? And that is why now people, almost 60 million people have gone to vote already. And they are not sticking them in the mail. Some cases, they're taking them right and putting them in the front there. Why? Because they want their vote counted at a time when there are laws from a certain administration to try to keep that. And this reminds blacks of what they had to fight for so many years ago. So they would take every advantage they can, African Americans and minorities and others, to express these rights. It is, and why is it so important? Economically. You know, this coronavirus has had just a devastating effect on Black people. We look, you know, and I know there are other questions, and we'll answer the questions about that, but the devastating effect it's had on the Black community makes people know that they have to try to find a solution, and the solution they see is through this electoral process where they can not only express their viewpoints, but get people in office who they think would represent them. And I'll leave my coronavirus remarks to the proper time.
Okay, so we've established that it was a hard struggle to get the right to vote. We've established that it is important on multiple levels, not just for policy formation, but also just simply because of what it means for people to have this ability to vote. So let's just understand why this right is significant today, or what does the voter landscape look like today? So Dr. Lieven, can you please tell us a little about what the voter landscape looks like today? Where do both of these parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, primarily get their supporter base from?
Well, the Republican Party is overwhelmingly, though not exclusively, white. That's the first thing to say about it. And it is composed, I would say, of three, not in any numerically equal, but three important components with a couple of sub-ones. The first, who are the absolute diehard permanent Republican supporters, are the religious conservatives. Mostly white, although it's important to note that a certain number, a small number of blacks, and a considerably larger number actually of Latinos vote for the Republican Party along those lines. The second category are the basically capitalists, the wealthy upper classes, but not all of them, I mean sections of them, who may in some cases be also attracted by the conservative religious, moral agenda, cultural agenda, but also are supporting the Republican Party for the sake of low taxes and laissez-faire, no state involvement in the economy, except of course when it comes to providing them with subsidies and bailing them out when they get into difficulties, as we saw in 2008 and again during the pandemic. Now the third category, then there's a third category which overlaps with the religious conservatives, which is basically the white South, which has always voted against black rights. Not all of it, there's also been a liberal white section in the South, but mostly. The swing constituency, which really revolutionized under Trump the Republican Party, and that started with the Tea Parties, and has to a great extent defected from the Democrats, is the northern white working classes, the former industrial working classes and the lower ranks of what in America is called the middle classes, white working classes and middle classes. They were the core part of the New Deal coalition from the 1930s on, the core Democratic constituency from there till the 1970s, 80s. A lot of them have now turned against the Democrats, partly, partly it is a racial thing, partly it's that they have felt very strongly for more than a generation now that the Democratic elites have abandoned them, that they don't care about their jobs, don't care about the state of their cities or their lives, don't care about their families. And of course, this feeling has been colossally strengthened by the economic and social decline of not these classes and these communities across the former industrial areas of the northern United States. Trump, although he hasn't done anything for them, took control of the Republican Party, above all because of that constituency. And then it must be said on the score of minorities that there is one, also a significant wrinkle, shall we say, in the Republican Party from that point of view, and that's the Cuban Americans, who are, of course, Latinos of a particular kind, but have swung more and more to the Republicans, partly out of hereditary, anti-left-wing, anti-communist feeling. It's rather striking that the two main leading Republican opponents of Trump in the Republican primaries in 2016 were both Cuban Americans, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. And Marco Rubio is a very probable Republican candidate, well, certainly a candidate for the Republican nomination for president in future. So that's the Republicans. The Democrats are even more mixed. There's the remains of the old white working class New Deal constituency, especially those who remain unionized. There is the black population. There is most, though by no means all, of the Latinos, partly attached to the Democrats because the Democrats have come to stand for much more open immigration and the legalization of present illegal immigrants within the United States, who are, of course, overwhelmingly Latino. And then there are the various sexual minorities who now identify with the Democratic Party because it stands very strongly for gender rights. And then there are a variety of different kinds of white liberal attached to the Democrats for a somewhat varied set of reasons, but including cultural liberalism and climate change, for example. And then the Democrats also have a obviously numerically very small, but financially very, very powerful bunch of very wealthy Americans. 33 or 36 billionaires, I think, among Kamala Harris's donors, chiefly drawn from the California tech elites, though not exclusively. There are also a lot of others, of course. And they support the Democrats chiefly on cultural grounds, partly on a variety of other grounds, including climate change. But they do not, on the whole, of course, favor very radical economic policies. One often finds their influence running together with that of the Republican wealthy elites. So you have two very broad coalitions, movements. The first past the post nature of the American electoral system really, really works, again, as the British one does, by the way, against smaller parties. A first past the post electoral system more or less forces people to come together in two big parties, whereas if you look at Germany, for example, there are many more major parties because they have a proportional representation system. The result is that the American parties conduct a large part of their battles among themselves because they're not really united ideological parties. They are coalitions, and coalitions which often disagree pretty strongly among themselves, as one saw in the Democratic primary campaign, where of course you had a very strong socialist movement led by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, which was, of course, they've now united behind Biden, but was very, very, very strongly opposed by the establishment Democrats, who are much more tied to the economic elites.
So I think the 2020 elections are unique in the sense that they are witnessing a new dimension to the political positions of these two political parties and sort of their voter base or their support base, and who funds them, who supports them, and where all of that comes from. So in order to understand that further and sort of take this conversation forward, we'll go back to Dr. Mitchell. Can you please explain to us, Professor, what are other unique factors about the 2020 elections? And sort of, do you observe that there is a political shift in the way that these parties are interacting with one another and people who are supporting these particular candidates? Where do you think that shift is coming from, if there is such a shift?
Thank you. That's a lot of different exciting questions. But I have to say, I'm going to go back to these institutional, ways of having our voting system. I mean, because for me, the big story of 2020 is the question of voter fraud. Right? This is something that we have heard about for some time. Actually, we've heard about it since the 2016 election, right? But so, this is something that has been raised as a concern by many people, including the President of the United States. And I'll just say that, of course, it should be a concern, because if we believe in equal right to vote and one person, one vote, voting fraud would severely impact the legitimacy of our democracy. And especially in this time when we are relying more and more on mail-in and absentee ballots, as well as registration procedures, one can imagine that there might be more room for voter fraud. And I think that this is one of the most important current issues in our 2020 election. And I think it's really important for us all to understand and recognize, and as we move in these last, as you said, 6 days before the election, there is no evidence of voter fraud of the sort of people stuffing ballot boxes, people busing themselves to places they shouldn't be voting and voting there, or voting twice, or impersonating other people in order to vote. There is no evidence, and I'm saying that from multiple rigorous studies that have been conducted by news organizations, by political scientists, who have, by President Trump's own voting commission, headed by Chris Kobach, went actively looking for instances of voter fraud. In the 2016 election, we were told even after the fact that there must have been huge amounts of voter fraud for the president to have lost the popular vote. There have been 4 documented cases. Of the 135 million votes cast in 2016, there have been 4, 2 of which were people who voted twice, 1 person who voted for her deceased husband. Those votes were recognized as fraudulent and thrown out. So there is no evidence of voter fraud in our elections, but the question of it is concerning because it results in increased bureaucratic obstacles to votes that actually impact certain groups of people more than others, and in particular, those include minority groups. So, when we think about institutional barriers to the vote put in place ostensibly to reduce voting fraud, things such as you need a government-issued photo ID and only a certain type of government-issued photo ID, such as Real ID in South Carolina is one example. Well, not everybody has those, the fancy new Real ID, state IDs or driver's licenses, right? It's an extra effort of time and money and documentation to be able to get those pieces of ID. And institutional barriers like this reduce voting, again, studies have shown, between 2 and 7%, depending on what kinds of barriers you put in place. And again, ostensibly to reduce the possibility of voter fraud that does not exist, okay? So 2%, say the low number, may not sound like a lot, but when you take 135 million votes from 2016 and you say, what's 2% of that? That's 2.7 million people. That is literally the population of the state of Qatar that we are disenfranchising as American citizens. The entire state of Qatar can no longer vote because we have put this institutional barrier in place. I mean, 2.7 million American citizens unable, because of bureaucracy, to cast their vote. There is hope on the horizon here. There have been some court cases recently that have ruled in favor of some of these institutional barriers. So those have garnered a lot of attention in the mass media. They are important cases to take into consideration. But overall, the trend this year, because of the pandemic, has been states making it easier, not harder, to vote because of the pandemic. And so we may actually see record numbers of voting. We've already seen record numbers of early vote, whether it's in person, as Maurice mentioned, or via mail. The question is whether those are just people who were going to vote anyway and they're just voting early, or whether we really are seeing a significant amount, because we usually don't get more than 55% of people voting in the US in a presidential election cycle, which is very, very low comparatively across, again, these advanced democracies. There are studies that are saying possibly the trends are showing we might get 15 million more people voting this year than 2016. That would get us up to 65%, if 70%. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing to feel like more people had the right to vote? And so I hope, again, as we see what happens with this election and we see what happens when we actually reduce the institutional barriers as opposed to increase them for people, I hope it gets people excited about institutional change, the opportunities that are going to be available to us after this election to think about how we can make our system more democratic. And, you know, I've already mentioned things like automatic voter registration. Maurice mentioned reinstating the Voter Rights Act. Both of these are already bills that have passed the House of Representatives. They just need to pass the Senate. But one final thing that I'll mention, because first past the post system has come up a lot, right, as one of kind of an institutional problem, right, in terms of how can we make sure that all voices are heard, that all kind of interests are represented, and that we find a consensus candidate, a majority consensus candidate, as opposed to squeaking by with pluralities of the vote. And a way to get past that is the ranked choice voting system. And I just recommend that everybody watch the state of Maine. This particular election cycle, I happen to be from Maine, so I have a particular pride and interest in that state. But they are the first state in this election cycle to use the ranked choice voting to choose the presidential candidate for that state. And this is a really important system because it maintains the element of choice and also insists that the final winning candidate has a majority of the vote. And I'll just quickly explain and then we'll end. But you know, it's just you rank your choices, and that's pretty common sense. Everybody understands what that means. You say, for example, as Anatol mentioned, third parties don't get any love in the US because people understand they're not going to get the plurality, so why waste your vote? You could now put the first party as your first choice. Show that you care about that third party, sorry. But when if they don't get the highest level, your vote is then transferred to that second choice. And so it ends up being that the candidate that has the most consensus among the most people ends up winning. And that can happen on the local level, the state level, and the national level. And not only does that help people feel their voices are heard, but it also promotes a different kind of politics, because people have to start talking to each other as allies in the fight, not as bitter enemies, right? If you're not somebody's first choice, you want that person to consider you as the second choice. So you don't bash your opponents so much as you try to show where the areas of agreement are and how you could compromise and how you would pay attention to different candidates and different parties' ideas. And I think those kinds of things are what our country really needs at this moment in time to move forward in productive ways.
Absolutely. So 2020 really does seem to be the year of change and establishing new trends. As Professor Mitchell just mentioned, we're noticing perhaps the state of Maine will establish a new trend for us. We're noticing that institutional barriers are reducing, even though we do have a lot of institutional barriers even now. So let's just talk about the instigator of all these changes, which is COVID-19, and go to Professor Maurice Jackson, hear a little about how COVID-19 is impacting or is expected to impact voting patterns, and whether it's going to sway the votes to a particular direction or it's expected to lead to a certain outcome, and why.
Thank you. Just one question. This election, COVID-19, of course, but there are other things that lead up to it also. This is the year that the U.S. Census was taken. And the U.S. Census is how you measure how many people are in the country. And then by the census, you determine the voting representation. So if a city like Washington gains people, it will have greater congressional representation, but it will also have more money towards federal appropriations. And so this has been a big push, especially within inner cities, to guarantee that everybody be counted. As the COVID crisis and everything is going about, there has been a distinct push to keep people from being counted. Now, again, somebody out of the United States, why would you not want the Black people, the minority people, the Hispanics, the Arab American people, the Native American people, the whites? Why would not you want people counted? Because, as I think Professor Lieven and others just said, representation is made upon this, but also state representation in the voter electoral college has nothing to do with congressional representation. So the more people you have in a certain area, the more congressional representation you get, and then therefore the more chance you get for economic dollars to come into your communities. And so this has been, and so therefore you hear the cuts of blue state, red state. So the blue states are generally those who, not necessarily progressive, but voted in the sense of democratic. So a state like New York would get more federal appropriations if it had more Congress. But then the chance, therefore, to stop and keep people from voting in those areas means that you are trying to keep the voter electorate from changing. So then you have that. Now, I don't say that, you know, it wouldn't have mattered whether COVID-19 not. Black folks were going to vote this year because the stocks, the conditions are also health but economic. And I think that this is different than any other time. It's not just a class, rich and poor. It's much, for example, if you look at the vote, at the people who've donated to campaigns, I saw a list the other day, far many more rich people have donated to Mr. Biden. Now, maybe not the top billionaires, but of course, billionaires do. Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, couldn't count themselves as Democrats. Now, and why? Because when the stock market goes down 600 points in one day, this represents a hurting on the super rich, and they are concerned about this too. So it's not just about taxes. It is about the loss of stock and other things like that. So these things are coming up. Now, with the COVID-19, it's had a disproportionate effect on not just blacks, but people, poor people and others. The unemployment rate, I think nationally in March was about 4%. That means for blacks, it was around 10, 11%. By May or June, it's 14%. By blacks, it's double, 28% in most cases. It doubles like that. So you're seeing this. You're seeing the millions of people who lost their jobs, who will not get their jobs back. You lose your job, you lose your health insurance. Then you have the question of African Americans and the minority population. In many cases, if you live in the city, if you're African American, maybe you work in a retail trade, or maybe you work in the service industry. That means hotels and hospitals and things like that, or maybe construction. Your jobs are shut down. You have no way. The Congress now, you know, I think if you were in the United States, you'd probably laughing at us. The idea that there has a chance for a $2 trillion bill to be passed that can give people relief. They will put some money in their pockets, unemployment checks every week so they can get over, so they can pay their rent, pay their bills. And then the Congress is dilly-dallying. Who cares about whether it's Democrat or Republican? People don't care about that when they're trying to pay their bills. It's just, so we have to look at that. It so happens that Ms. Pelosi, who's the head of the House of Representatives, has done a magisterial job in trying to get something passed that will guarantee that all the money that's passed down does not go to the super rich so they can bail out their corporations. That's not what it's about. You remember that even when Mr. Obama was elected a couple of years ago, and he took over the economic crisis from Mr. Bush, he even allowed those super rich people to get compensated, to not pay for the sins they had with bringing the economic crisis. So you have all of these matters. Now you have blacks. You have, we see that in the cities, I think 70,000 new cases a day, 500,000 new cases a month. I mean, I'm just, how can that be? And when we look at what's happening in a place like Japan and Korea, who successfully monitor the whole situation. Here, the richest country in the world. Then you look at the fact that they can be up to 400 million people dead by January. And this, 200,000 now, we found out, I just heard a study today, that if we had had judicial policies, it could have been less than 10,000 people, but we didn't. What do people look at? How can people in anywhere look? And it's the question of wearing a mask that can save millions of lives, thousands of lives and millions. And a leader of the country makes fun of people who don't wear masks. It just makes no sense. And if I were looking from another country, no matter what, I would think you're a bunch of idiots. Leaders who say that when you gather around and when you gather around in open stadiums, it's criminal. It's prosecutory, because you're bringing deaths to people. So you have that. Now you have the African American community who's lost their job. Now, the other thing comes in this. People who are poor generally live in very close proximity. The best example would be in Qatar, where you had the large numbers of infections in migrant communities because people were living together, as opposed to the general population, which may not have lived together. Now, it's a bit different, but there are certain similarities. And so people in the community have to take very precautions. They still have to take the bus to work. They still have to go to the grocery store to work. They still have to go to the service if they can keep those jobs. So it has tremendous impact. And once they've lost that job, it is hell to catch up. It's already hard to catch up in good times. And so the unemployment rate just doubles. And with all those benefits. And so these things are having a tremendous impact. And are they going to affect people, black people, white people, everybody generally going to look at their pocket, and they're going to make decisions. So if you wonder why people are going to vote now, it's because they view it as being the basis of their livelihood, the future for their children.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yeah, I do think all those factors are absolutely important and absolutely relevant today. Just before we go to your questions, our audience, we just have one last question for Dr. Lieven. And I'm sure he'll keep this brief, but we really want to hear from him on this. Dr. Lieven, what do you think is the impact of the US elections on the US foreign policy, particularly in today's environment where we see the rise of, right-wing politics and, right-wing ideologies and populism and all of these things. So how would you see these elections, these 2020 elections in that context? And then we'll move on to the questions after this.
Well, one has to distinguish between the indirect effects, the sort of the moral and cultural effects around the world, which will obviously be heavily affected by this result. And also, of course, if God forbid there is a constitutional crisis, a disputed election result, and mass protests, then that will be a serious blow to American international prestige. As far as policies are concerned, in certain respects, it will make, I think, much less difference than people think. If Mr. Biden wins, policy towards China will not change significantly. Policy towards Russia will not change significantly. The Democrats would like to be much tougher on Russia, but you can't go too far in that direction without getting into really, really serious dangers. Support for Israel will not change. Biden has made that very clear, and so forth and so on. But there will be important changes, perhaps, or probably, or to some degree. The most important is climate change. Trump is a climate change denier. He has tried to roll back measures to limit climate change. Biden has promised to rejoin the Paris Agreement. How much he will be willing or able to do in terms of changing American policies, we'll have to see. Something will depend on his desire to do so. A lot will depend on whether the Democrats can take control of the Senate, or whether a Republican Senate will continue to block them. And of course, whether the Supreme Court will, under its now huge Republican majority, will block Democratic legislation. In this part of the world, Biden has promised to return to the Iran nuclear deal, which Obama created, which Trump scrapped. But then there has also been a lot of talk among Biden's advisors of renegotiating that deal with the Iranians, which the Iranians have made absolutely clear they will not do. It's back to the deal or nothing. So we have to see what happens on that. And then there is the issue of immigration, which is partly a foreign policy issue. And there, Biden has promised basically to reverse all Trump's measures. And certainly he will reverse, the really inhumane measures that Trump introduced. Whether the Democrats would reverse all Trump's measures, that might depend on the state of the economy, because, of course, encouraging large-scale immigration in circumstances of very high unemployment is a pretty explosive strategy. And they would undoubtedly look at the opinion polls over that. So this is how foreign policy will be affected.
Thank you, Professor Lieven, for sort of quickly, giving us an understanding of how the impact will sort of materialize, possibly.
Could I just say something about this?
Go ahead.
While I agree that there may not be a fundamental change on policy, there are certain things that we do have to look at. I do think that that under Biden administration, the people who were responsible for the killing of Khashoggi there'd have probably been something on that. I think that they would not have been, it could not be, because Americans did not want this absolute cuddling up to what happened in Saudi Arabia there. I do think there will be discussions about the extension of settlements in the West Bank and things like that. I do think there will be an urge for Israel to stop that. I do think that there would not be this absolute blackmailing of African countries, as was done in the case of Sudan, to try to make them recognize the state of Israel. I think that those things would not go that far. So those are fundamental changes, fundamental things that has to be discussed in light of the Middle East. Professor Lieven is exactly right around Iran nuclear. I think they'll have to go back and have to just negotiate in good faith. But a little nuances can make a big difference in the lives of millions of people.
Thank you.
I'll say that I think that this will lead to
I just wanted to mention that just to follow up on the Khashoggi point, on the settlements point, the Sudan point, it's quite arguable as to whether or not there would even be a blockade in Qatar right now if we had had Hillary Clinton as president instead of Donald Trump. So there can be major differences in foreign policy and what would be tolerated, certainly.
Absolutely, and thank you.
I wonder about that, to be honest. I think there will be serious divisions within the Democratic Party about this. Clearly, the more radical wing will want really serious changes. The Democratic establishment has been so closely tied to Israel for so long, and of course, Israel also plays an extremely important part behind the scenes in backing the alliance with Saudi Arabia, that I think things will change. And I think, Jocelyn, you're right about there would have been a much bigger reaction against Khashoggi and against the blockade. But I don't think one should look for miracles from President Biden.
Absolutely. I think they're all possibilities at this point. And I mean, there is a lot of room for a lot of changes. But safe to say, whatever ends up happening, it will definitely be interesting. And we hope that we can have our panelists again to discuss the aftermath of these elections. But before we leave or before we do anything else, we want to address some questions from our audience. So we will have Ms. Asil from the US Embassy pointing out some questions that we will address. So Ms. Asil.
Thank you, Khansa. Thank you, everyone. So one of the questions that we have from our audience on Zoom, what do you think are some flaws the electoral system college has?
I mean, I know that is something we have discussed earlier in depth, but Professor Mitchell, could you perhaps sort of summarize that in maybe a short answer for our audience member, whoever asked that question?
Okay, thank you. You know, I really appreciate being able to see the chat and the question and answer as well. And, you know, in general, there were several questions about this idea, Asil, right, in terms of reforms in general, institutional reforms, right? And also this great question about, do you think that the founding fathers really envisioned that we'd be so polarized and have such partisan politics? And that's absolutely not. And that is actually part of the problem, right? Because they didn't have political parties as part of their original envisionment of the US system. And partisanship is a problem when it comes to several of these possible reforms. So I just wanted to mention that maybe, you know, changing the partisanship of several important facets can be some of the reform that we can look to. You know, we could have a nonpartisan committee set up for various important national matters, such as when to invoke the 25th Amendment, which is when a president is incapacitated, say a president gets COVID and is rushed to a hospital. When do we invoke the 25th Amendment to immediately make sure that the vice president is able to execute important national matters? That was not invoked for political reasons. And so I think that's one of the reasons, that's an example of something that we could do that could reform things in a nonpartisan way. Nonpartisan committees for things such as drawing the districts of states. As Maurice had mentioned, gerrymandering is a huge issue. And it just doesn't make any sense that whoever is in charge of the state vis-a-vis the governorship of these decade elections, right, suddenly gets to draw maps that advantage one party over another for the next 10 years. So these are some ways to take the partisanship out of what wasn't even envisioned at the beginning. you know, to kind of reform the electoral system. And I do want to say just one plug for the Electoral College reform in particular. There's an excellent book out just this year written by Wegman on reform of the Electoral College, why it would be a good idea. And I can recommend this book to everybody because he's a New York Times member of the editorial board and actually writes well, right? He's not a political scientist, he's a journalist, so you can enjoy his book. And he writes very understandably about the problems with the Electoral College and how to solve it. And how to solve it is within our reach without a constitutional amendment. We can do the Interstate Voter Compact, where states actually make an agreement that they will have their electors vote for whoever receives the popular vote. That is something that is within our reach that we don't need a constitutional amendment for, and that can dramatically increase the democratic nature of our system. So I love this question about reforms, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say too.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Yes, so since we ended up combining sort of these three questions about what is the problem, what did the founding fathers envision, and what can we reform, Dr. Lieven, maybe you'd like to address this shortly as well?
I think Jocelyn's put her finger on it. What can be reformed is what doesn't depend on a constitutional change, because basically the constitution is not reformable by constitutional means with such partisanship. As I said, it gives such advantages to the Republicans. The Republicans will not change it for obvious reasons. The only possibility perhaps is that the parties might come together to try to remove some of the things that actually point towards systemic breakdown. You know, but that will only be in an area where neither party has a clear or permanent advantage. I hope I don't sound too cynical in saying that you know, to change the Republican dedication to the state rights, the right of state administrations to run elections and establish electoral rules and mandates, probably what you would need massive manipulation by the Democrats in Democrat-controlled states, because that would level the playing field, and then the Republicans might have to agree to, you know, to a change. But I do think that I hope that anything that can be done by agreement or without a constitutional amendment will be done by a Biden administration or by agreement between the states, because I think there are really serious dangers in the existing system for American democracy.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that answer. Dr. Jackson, would you like to add anything to it?
No, I think they've adequately covered it, but just one point. You know, the Democratic Party has had since 2010 zeros. You know, when President Bush was elected, to deal with this, and they've not adequately dealt with it. Now, if the Congress switches, if the Democrats do get the uphold, I don't know if I see anything happening like that. With them, I can see this changing. I don't know whether they take the issue up. I will say this: one issue coming up as an important issue is the issue of the state of Washington, D.C. When Washington, D.C., you have 700,000 people, which is larger than 4 or 5 states who don't have voter representation for constitutional reasons. Article 1 in the clause, basically the District of Columbia should be the federal enclave, which is the capital in all those buildings. But in short, there will be a measures put forth to the Congress about making Washington, D.C. the 51st state. And we in Washington, D.C. pride ourselves in being open-minded around things like this. So it's a possibility that there can be fundamental changes on this. You know, if you're African-American, if you're Black like I am, if you live a long time, you have no choice but to be optimistic. You have to put everything on the table and fight for every little thing. So the optimism that comes out from a person who, in some cases, has had no reason to be optimism should be obvious. Democracy is at stake, and the extension of democracy is at stake. And that's why all of this becomes so important.
Thank you. Absolutely. And I think we can take one more question in the interest of time. Ms. Asil, do we have?
Thank you. Yeah. There are like different questions that I can link them together because they have the same focus. These are from the registration list. So how the outcome of the U.S. elections would affect and shape the politics in the Middle East and the relations with Qatar and the Middle East?
Thank you. So Dr. Lieven, would you like to address this first?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Jocelyn. I think that a Biden victory would lead to a reduction in the American commitment to Saudi Arabia, at least the total commitment shown by the Bush administration. I think one would get back to something a bit more balanced. But, you know, once again, I mean, don't forget that the commitment to, the basic commitment to Saudi Arabia has been a bipartisan American commitment for a very long time now, and, you know, is related to wider American interests. I can, on Iran, and I think, yes, I mean, I hope very much that there will be pressure to end the boycott. And I mean, hopefully that the Saudis and their allies will give it up, partly because it hasn't very manifestly has not worked. On Iran, we'll have to see, you know, whether Biden will have the determination, you know, really to go back to the original nuclear deal. One shouldn't forget that so many of Obama's battles over getting this deal through, and one reason why it took so long was that he had to fight ferocious battles, not just with the Republicans, but with many Democratic senators as well. And those senators have not gone away, and the forces that back them have not gone away. So we'll have to see. One thing that I think will remain the same, as it has actually been under Trump as well, is that there will not be a return to strategies of military intervention. The opinion polls on that in the United States are so clear, the tremendous opposition of a majority of Americans to more military adventures, interventions, Iraq, Libya, whatever, that I don't think that either administration would go in for this. And on Afghanistan, which I forgot to mention, I think Biden will essentially continue Trump's policy of trying to withdraw as quickly as possible and leave behind some settlement that will hold together for long enough for its eventual collapse not to be too humiliating for the United States.
If I could just add something, but you know, I don't know all of the intricacies of Qatari foreign policy and things like that. I don't know if anyone outside of the ruling circle does, but there are certain things that are obvious. It's obvious that the United States is not happy that Qatar has Al Jazeera there. It's obvious that the United States is not happy that Qatar does not bow to Saudi Arabia. It's obvious that the United States is not happy with the relationships with Iran. It's obvious that it's not happy with hosting and trying to push forward these talks. It's also obvious that whatever the next administration, they will not consider the whole of Africa as an S-hole country, and that Africa itself will get that, and Africa is, of course, very tied to the Middle East. So one has to look at all these things and say it has to be better than what we see there now. Of course, we know that a country like Qatar in the Middle East and all countries are getting tremendous pressure from the administration. That's why Mr. Pompeo and everybody is there all the time. But I don't think that, from what I can tell, and especially in relation to Israel and things like that, I don't see a continuation of some of the policies now. I can only see that there may be certain people who may come into the administration who may have different ideas and push for a more balanced policy. And the last thing is oil is not what it used to be, especially as we're speaking now then, we see the changes and things like that. It's a new world.
Absolutely.
I'll just make one final point, if that's okay. Just to sum it up, I know we're at the end.
Yeah.
Khansa, thank you. So I'll just say, again, this isn't my expertise, so I appreciate hearing from Anatol and Maurice on this. But I will say that for the fiscal year 2020, the US budget which is the final year, set, under the Trump administration, for this first term. Defense has $633 billion, and the State Department has $48 billion. 633 billion versus 48 billion. I hope that if we see a change in administration, that we see a little bit less money going to military and a little bit more money going to our State Department, our diplomatic efforts, the ways of interacting with the world that don't involve military force. So, we can all hope.
Thank you for that very insightful, conclusive comment. And I wish we could stay here and debate more, but unfortunately, time being what it is, before we conclude, Ms. Karima, would you like to add on something?
Yes, thank you so much, Khansa, and thank you to Dr. Jackson and Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Lieven for your really insightful comments. As a U.S. government official, I'd say, there are obviously some things I would disagree with that had been said, about one administration over the other, but that's not relevant. I think what was relevant to this discussion, what I hope was the takeaway for all of you, was that the United States is really, and continues to be, I believe, a space where we can have these open conversations and dialogues and agree to disagree and respect each other's opinions and not be judgmental. I think it's so beautiful that all three of you had such diverse, varying opinions on one subject. And that's, frankly, in my opinion, what makes America great, that we can all bring those various opinions to the table. And if you remember my opening statement about remembering one thing that I say today, and that was the Gandhi quote, I want to close with that. And again, the quote was, be the change you want to see in the world. So if you believe that your voice is not being represented, and you believe that your rights are being infringed upon, again, I'm biased as a U.S. government official, but also as a U.S. citizen, I firmly believe that the United States provides that space for every voice to be heard, for every voice to stand up and say, this is not the America I believe in, or this is not the America that I know or want it to be. And this is the change I want to see in the world. And this is how I want to affect it. And I think Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Lieven, and Dr. Jackson brought up some very interesting notions and proposals for how that change might look like. And America is a dynamic society. It's ever evolving. We are so diverse. But again, that's what makes us beautiful. And so having everybody at the table, having their voices heard, again, will only benefit the United States, will only make it stronger. And perhaps the Constitution of today is not going to be the Constitution of tomorrow. And that's great. As Dr. Mitchell said, the Founding Fathers had a vision, but the America that we know today is not the America that they had envisioned. And that's a good thing. The America of today is a product of many people coming together and having their voices heard. The work continues. I think I'd agree with Dr. Maurice. It's not a perfect system, but I think we're well on our way. And the fact that we can have a discussion like this today, that's hosted by the U.S. government, I think is testament to the fact that we live by the words that we preach, that we believe in a dynamic society where every voice matters. And if we can live out that example and be that change we want to see in the world, then I hope and pray that the world will be a better place. So again, I want to thank you all for your contributions today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, for this opportunity. Thank you for our panelists. I mean, it's safe to say that we see so many embassies in this world, but we don't see a lot of these embassies hosting discussions like this, where diverse panelists can come together and talk about that embassy, criticize that system, give constructive suggestions, and come back again for similar discussions. So I think safe to say that we do have a lot to learn, and we have a lot to, that we can improve together and grow with. And 2020 is a very, very interesting point, because we have 6 days to the elections. And I think the professors here sort of gave us a glimpse into what the world might look like under both presidents. But whoever it is, We're excited to see where it goes. We're excited to see which minorities get more rights and how their struggle for minority rights continues to evolve. Thank you, our audience, for joining us, for engaging with us, for taking this time out of your schedule, and hopefully we will see you in our next program.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you, Khansa. Khansa, you did a great job at moderation. It was really excellent moderation. You should feel very proud of yourself. I enjoyed it.
I second that. I think the U.S. Embassy should give her a full-time job.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.